And I should.
This meeting is being recorded.
If you could all mute, or what I can do is that I can mute everybody and unmute Anna and Gayle.
Okay, that would be good.
Okay,
And
so hold on. Okay, I've asked you, Gayle and Anna, to unmute. Anna's.
I have unmuted. Gayle has to unmute. Okay. So one last thing to check is if you have questions, would you put them in the chat box? So at the end of the presentation, we can go through the questions in the chat box for Gayle. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure once more, because Gayle was interviewed some months ago about her memoir, Missing Persons. So this is her second book for the FAB interviews, and it's Immeasurable Outcomes. And we're very fortunate to be very early in the process, because it just came out from Johns Hopkins University Press. And it has received wonderful reviews. And I'd like to just read you one from Mark Edmondson, who is the author of Why Teach and Why Write. Gayle Green has the mind of a brilliant scholar and the heart of a superb teacher. Both are dramatically on display in this remarkable book. So, without further ado, Gayle, please tell us what led you to write this book.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for hosting this also, and everybody who's made it possible. Rage, rage and fear. They're really good rocket repellent. I mean, they really they're motivators. They're high motivators for a writer. For one thing, I saw terrible things were being said about the humanities. The humanities are being cut. The liberal arts are no longer useful. They're wasteful. They're a waste of time, waste of money. They're fraudulent. They're frivolous. And these, of course, we know who these voices are. They're the red state governors and the politicians. And anyway, the humanities were being cut. I was noticing a change in, our students were rushing to STEM, and STEM was suddenly in and the humanities were out. And even at a liberal arts enclave like the Claremont colleges, they were just enormous. I mean, our enrollments have held pretty well, come to think of it. But in places all over the country, enrollments had plummeted so much that administrators felt justified to cut the humanities, to cut programs, departments, and entire colleges were going belly up. Small liberal arts colleges were going belly up. So something had happened since the time I went to college, when one in 5 people, graduates, were in the liberal arts, and now it was like 1 in 20. And that's an old figure. I'm sure it's much less now. What had happened? What had hit us? Because I never for a moment doubted that I was doing and my students were doing essential work. It seemed to me really essential what had gone on in our classes. But society, public opinion had turned against us. I mean, public opinion has turned against higher education generally lately. I mean, and not only Republicans, but Democrats are now thinking it's not worth it. Something like 50% of young people between the ages of 18 and 34, I consider that young, have said, it's not worth the time, it's not worth the money. A bachelor's degree is no longer worth it. Well, what had hit us in the time, since I had graduated college, when The liberal arts were riding high, higher education was riding high. What exactly it hit us? That was the main motivator. That and a lot of anger and a lot of fear for the profession, for the humanities.
So when would you say that this war on education started? And what is the political agenda in back of it? Who
Yeah.
gains and who loses?
Oh boy, that took me back. I mean, I had to go back to the middle of the century, middle of the 20th century, when I graduated Berkeley in 1964. The master plan, that UC master plan, which had funded, the University of California and the state colleges and the community colleges. And I got 2 degrees for practically nothing, 5 years at Berkeley and 2 degrees, a BA and a master's. So what happened was ostensibly Ronald Reagan. I mean, he fired the first shot at the UC, and he ran against the University of California, not only against Brown, he ran against the entire system. He was going to put down those rioters at Berkeley, those lazy beatniks. If they paid tuition, they'd appreciate the education they're getting. And he brought in the militia, literally. I mean, he put down, as he promised he would, he put down the rebellion. Okay. So that had happened. Let's see Reagan. Okay, I graduated in 64. Reagan, I can't even remember the year now. What was it? Okay, yeah, it was 20 years later, almost 20 years later. Behind Reagan was Koch money, was corporate America. I mean, what the war on education is, and I use the present tense, not the past tense, is corporate America's attempt to take over higher education. They're very savvy about this. I mean, they know that who controls education controls the future. The Democrats have been a little bit sloppier about catching on to that. And you can see this in DeSantis, who is truly taking over education. Don't say gay, don't bring up racism. I mean, that whole thing. It's very strong and very alive. But corporate America, okay, this is a long, complicated, and very sad story. Koch, okay, what happened was with the UC master plan, with the funding of education, the GI Bill, millions of graduates were coming out of these great state universities, and they had ideas, they had ideals. They believed in human rights, they believed in the rights of workers, unions were strong, they believed in the rights of other people. They made social movements, right? Remember social movements? The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement. Now, this was going to get expensive. They were also this would cost in terms of salaries, it would cost in terms of regulations. Corporate America got scared in the early 70s. And the result was Reagan, a decade later, who was really a figurehead of the Koch brothers' money. Sorry, I do sound conspiratorial, and it's hard for me to keep a lid on when I talk about this stuff also, because it's so infuriating. The Koch machinery is stealthy. I mean, most people don't even know what's going on now. I mean, finally, journalists like Jane Mayer's Dark Money and a book called Copeland and Democracy and Change. Now there's a lot of good writing about it, but I haven't seen that higher education people have assimilated this, that this has been attacking us. Why? Because educated people cost money. There's more money to be made from ignorance than from intelligence. They don't want critical thinkers. They don't want people who will question. They want a compliant and plentiful workforce. And that's basically the agenda behind the war on education. And the thing is they're so effective because they're stealthy, because we don't know it's happening. And they have seized, they have truly, I'm sorry, I am beginning to sound conspiratorial about this, but there is very good writing about it. And I'm happy to send a list, because these books are not well known enough. Democracy in Chains, Dark Money, Cokeland. Anyway, so this is the agenda behind it. Who wins is corporate America, who wins is the bottom line of multinational corporations and the 0.01%. That's who wins. Who loses is everybody else. Students lose because what this was most effective with K-12. K-12 so-called reform. It's a long and complicated story. Sorry, guys, but it's in my book and it's in a lot of other books. K-12 reform, which reduced K-12 to test and assess regime, which bores students. I mean, this is why students are turning off to higher education. They only want higher education as a degree, as a credential so they can get a job, because their schooling has been test and assess, drills and skills, and it's really turned them off to schools. It also has turned teachers off. Teachers are leaving in droves. So K-12 was the easier one to get hold of for corporate America. And I'm talking about No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and Common Core, which had major Gates Foundation funding behind it. So higher education is a little more difficult to get hold of because we've got a lot of Nobel Prizes. We've got a lot of prestige in the world. We're still the number one, we're still number one in terms of higher education. We're losing a little bit in the rankings because of this corporate coup, exactly. But but anyway, test and assess is coming our way. And that was kind of when I retired, when this test and assess regime came to Scripps College, an enclave. I mean, the Claremont colleges are enclaves of the liberal arts. Suddenly I was required to produce measurable student learning outcomes on my syllabus. And I said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? What we do is not measurable. What we do is human development. What you want is something you can measure, because measurement is management. And this is, the Gates, the technocrats' dream, which is everybody else's nightmare, really. But it had come to Scripps College and I was out of there. Anyway, that was when I retired and decided I would write this book, because it seemed to me very important that people understand that you can't measure our outcomes. Our outcomes are human beings, are the human infrastructure of society, are humane beings. And this was being really subjected to this incredible travesty. Maybe more than you wanted to know.
So what do you think the implications are for democracy?
Terrible. Because democracy requires people who can think, who can read, who can understand the implications of who profits, who can understand exactly the process that's going on. Authoritarianism thrives on ignorance, and also the sense that people have of disempowerment. Disempowerment makes rage. And this is where education, how you define education matters so much, because if you define it as something that's poured into the student's head, as Bill Gates does. I mean, I can show you clips where he says that very thing. He pour information into the student's head, and then the student regurgitates that on a test. That reduces the student to a passive recipient of knowledge who has no role in her education. Whereas a small discussion class, I mean, see, what this entire process made me realize was how important, how very essential the small discussion classes are, because students get a sense of agency. They play a role in their own education. They're not simply, I don't pour knowledge into their head. We discuss, we negotiate, they articulate their positions. They negotiate their positions with other people. They learn to get along. It's like kind of a mini society, a small discussion class. It's like There's a social contract. There's unstated and stated kinds of rules. And so people learn to get along with other people. The other thing we do that's so essential to democracy is teach them to read, because reading the word is really reading the world. I mean, you're interpreting. And this is where Shakespeare is so wonderful, because there's so many ways you can interpret Shakespeare. And, kids they come to blows over, how can you say this isn't a nasty patriarchal play? This is the most terrible thing I've read, Damien of the Shrew. And other kids say, yeah, but look, I mean, she's plain. She doesn't mean that speech. Or The Merchant of Venice, which is so difficult to teach. Anti-Semitic. No, it's not anti-Semitic. It's showing a society that's full of anti-Semites. Well, I mean, we talk about that. We clash. Isabel, the character who's will not lay down her virginity for the life of her brother. I mean, really, there's a lot of ways of reading that character, interpreting. So they're exercising their minds in a way that makes them fit for democracy, in a sense, because what's out there is a jungle, and I'm not talking about tigers and lions. I'm talking about human beings who have agendas for us, who are trying to sell us something, or trying to get us to buy a product or to buy into a point of view. We've got influencers. I love that word. And we have PR people and advertise. I mean, never have there been more people trying to get our attention, trying to get our money, trying to get our ideals. And students need to know how to survive this world. They have to know how to read other people, interpret, read between the lines. Shakespeare's just wonderful for that, because for one thing, his tragic heroes they fall because they're bad readers. It's an object lesson in reading, teaching Shakespeare, because look at Lear. He listens to the lies and doesn't listen to the truth, doesn't know how to hear his daughters. Look at Macbeth. Oh, don't go there. Don't listen to that woman. And look at Brutus, who gets persuaded into a bloody political coup. And he doesn't want to shed blood. He's not that kind of person. He doesn't know himself well enough to know who to listen to. And this is like Othello, okay? Don't listen to that guy. I mean, they're bad readers. And so that's the thing we're talking about in these plays. We're talking about interpretation and how you need to listen, you need to see. You don't need to project what you want to see onto what's out there. And you have to learn to very carefully listen. All this is, I mean, it's very complicated what goes on in a small discussion group. And the funny thing was, I did not realize that really until I started writing this book, because I've been teaching since I was 23, that's way more than half my lifetime now. And
Gayle,
yeah.
Gayle, in your book, you provide such wonderful testimony from students and alums of the transformative power of liberal arts education. So can you give us a couple of examples?
Yeah, yes, that was another revelation. Writing the book was talking to our alums and writing to them and getting their responses and interviewing our graduating seniors and so forth. Well, I mean, there's so many ways that a liberal arts, it was very heartening what I heard from alums. Transformative. They're the obvious things like this school opened my eyes. I see the world differently now. I'm not the same person I was when I came to Scripps, and you can hear that all over the country. I mean, Ken Burns is saying that about Hampshire College now, which is, barely surviving. It's about to go under. Ken Burns has taught probably more history to more people than many. Anyway, transformative. Also, there's studies, very interesting studies now about quality of life later, that how people feel about their lives, how they feel about their work, has to do with a very few things that happened in college. Did they have a professor who took an interest in them? Did they have a mentor? Did they have an extended writing project where the professor worked with the personal touch? I mean, what, you know, and this actually can be studied. There's numbers, there's data. That's what everybody wants. That shows that, you know, a few experiences in college, personal experiences, personal human relationships are so much more important than the technology that is being so lavished, you know, so much is being spent on it. So there are those studies. There's employability. Actually, liberal arts, I Googled, you know, the other night, let's see, what was it? Does it pay to attend liberal arts college? And I expected all the, you know, wrong answer. I got the right answer right on Google. It said, yeah, it does. You make actually more money going to a small liberal arts college than you do. You know, I thought, wow, the word actually is out. So there's employability, but there's also, okay, what can I say? The humanization. I mean, what the humanities is about is making people, it's about human beings. We study human beings, we study the past, the creation of human beings, but it's also about humanization. And we are a society absolutely in the throes of dehumanization. So the resistance to dehumanization that comes out of a small liberal arts college, I mean, many more of our graduates are civically engaged than other you know, I mean, there's a very high percentage of people who go into advocacy, nonprofits, political, social work. I mean, the kinds of things that sustain a democracy, that make people understand about voting. So that is like, I don't know, I keep thinking of Theodore Adorno's summary of what the purpose of education. He says it very simply: never again Auschwitz. I mean, I think that sums it up. I mean, that really does sum up the purpose of education. What we're trying to do in the humanities, when I say humanization, we're trying to create people. We're trying to bring out of people. We don't create people. We're not Frankensteins. We are trying to bring out the best in people, the human quality, the humanization. And Adorno says it was indifference to the fate of others. It was self-interest that made the circumstances that could lead to Auschwitz. And we never again Auschwitz. I think that sums up a philosophy of education, you know, better than anything I can say.
In your book, you do such a wonderful job of illuminating the importance of conversations, relationships, and community building in the classroom. Do you think that type of approach can be duplicated in a public university or public college? Because Scripps has very small classes.
Yeah. Well, yes, I think it could be, but I think people have to rethink education and reprioritize their spending to make small classes, to make small, you know, classes where interaction is possible and where the professor is sufficiently supported. That means not adjuncts, because they're not supported. I mean, they're exploited. But at a place like Scripps, tenure is still pretty much alive and well. And tenure is a great morale builder, I'll tell you that, because it gives a person a stake in the institution. So I think basically, and one alum said this on Facebook, I think all schools should be like our school. I thought, well, bloody right, they should, you know, and they could be, because when you think of all the money they spend on, well, the bureaucracy is just it's horrible right now. I mean, it's gotten junk the assessment office, junk the you know, consultants that are barnacled to these offices, trim the administrators. The administrators have expanded exponentially, you know, hundreds of times more than the faculty have. Get rid of most of them. I mean, some of them are necessary because the world has become more complicated and there's all these state, you know, regulations and stuff. I'm not saying get rid of all the administration, but I am sure saying get rid of a lot of it. trim athletic spending, you know. I mean, schools that exist in the shadow of where the football team is the main event, that shouldn't be allowed. And, you know, it's known which schools are doing this. Now, to the credit, I mean, okay, let me just say, when you think about it, it doesn't really cost much to have a professor around a table with 12 students. And that's kind of the cheapest form of education. I mean, there's a lot of people who would teach that way for very little. They're called adjuncts. And, you know, but the sciences cost more. I'm not talking about the sciences here. That's a different thing. They need labs, they need grants, they need all kinds of support. We don't. But the humanities are really not expensive. So what schools, major, huge universities need to do is restructure so that they allow, you know, these conditions that are conducive to learning, that are conducive to transformation and humanization. And some of the schools, to their credit, have done this. I mean, University of Michigan, University of Texas at Austin, UCLA, I think CUNY has, I think Arizona State, and some of these huge, you know, factories are actually making small liberal arts colleges within their structure. Now, that's not an easy thing to do because the priority in education, what professors get rewarded for is research, publication. That's the prestige, you know, that's where the goodies lie. So you have to persuade teachers, professors, that teaching is valuable, and academics haven't been terribly good at that. And I heard that UC Berkeley used to have one of these small, I think it was called an honors thing. Worked very, very well. I talked to alums of that. They loved it. They had a small college experience within UC Berkeley. I didn't have that. I had classes of 500. I had total anonymity at Berkeley. There was one exception, one professor who I got to know, and that was your brother-in-law, Anna, Norman Rabkin. But I'll read something about that if you like. But these are, but you see, professors don't want to be called away from their research to teach in these smaller, teaching is hard. I mean, it requires a lot of work. And if all the rewards are in research, it's difficult to kind of sustain and that's what happened at Berkeley. The guy who founded it, I don't know if he retired or if he died, but the project went with him. So it's difficult, but you have to reprioritize and you have to get people believing in this enough. And look, right now we are facing such disengagement from students. Post-pandemic, I mean, faculty aren't able to get them back, you know, they don't come to classes. If supposedly it's in person, they don't come. When they come, they are, you know, on their phones. And they're turning against higher education. I mean, they're just saying it's not worth my time. Well, we have to persuade them otherwise. And the way we know how to do it. Everybody knows what works. Look where Bill Gates sends his kids. That's what works. Small classes with personal interaction. That's what works. And rich people know that. That's why they send their kids to Scripps, you know, and to other places where they will get this kind of attention. So we have to restructure education. Movements are being made that way, but much more has to be done.
So Gayle, why don't you give us a taste of your writing by reading us a little excerpt?
You know, this pleases me very much because it is about Norman Rabkin, who was your husband's brother, I know. And so, yeah, this is a section called "The Fox Knows Many Things." It starts with a quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, defines intelligence. He says, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." I love that quote. It's one of the things we try to teach, is that, you know, A is true and not A. It can be true also, and people have different perspectives. So, or as Norman Rabkin used to say, The fox knows many things. I lucked into Rabkin's Shakespeare seminar, my first semester of graduate school, Berkeley. A Shakespeare play, he said, is like a Rorschach ink blot, where you first see one image and then another. First the rabbit, then the duck. It's difficult to see both images at once, but once you've seen that, each is truly there. Neither can be unseen. The figure will not quite resolve into one clear and certain shape ever again. Rabkin was fond of quoting Aesop's fable. The fox knows many things. The hedgehog knows one big thing. He had a wry, playful wit and agile intelligence that made him very like a fox. The semester I took his course, I audited a Milton course where I encountered a surefire hedgehog, two of them, Stanley Fish and John Milton, about as hedgehoggy as they get. In Rabkin and Fish, I saw how different types of sensibilities draw us to different authors. Rabkin was felled by a tumor that put him in a wheelchair, retired early, and wrote no more books. Fish is still going strong, full of zealous, I don't know how many of you guys know this guy, Stanley Fish, op-ed pages, and he's so sure of himself, pumping out pronouncements and op-eds, showing us the error of our ways, as he showed us students how our misreadings of Paradise Lost were signs of our fallen intellects. Fish had a pipeline to Milton, and Milton had a pipeline to God. And that was so unlike Norman Rabkin, who knew that the fox knew many things. I wonder if Rabkin had gone on writing and teaching, could his wise, gentle voice have made itself heard? You don't meet a lot of foxes these days. People want certainty, the authoritative, authoritarian, the middle ground, the nuances going the way of the polar ice caps. Anyway, that's my tribute to Norman Rabkin, who was my favorite professor.
Thank you.
I loved him.
It's a lovely piece. Do we have any questions in the chat? Vivian, can you read them?
Yes, let's see. Let me start. What role does the media play in keeping the corporate agenda and the information crucial to understanding it from the public?
A big one. I mean, that's one thing I discovered is most of what one reads in like the New York Times, the Washington Post is better, but it's a very corporate media, and if Bill Gates speaks, his words are, megaphoned around the world. So it's it's very it's been pro-reform. It has not given Diane Ravitch, who is my hero, who's a whistleblower against the reform movement, essentially. The New York Times gives her no press at all. If it does mention her, it mentions her with condescension. I've got a whole file on this, and it's absolutely appalling. So reform, meaning No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and the Common Core, are given a huge megaphone, and the things that teachers have had to make their own voice against this, and they're wonderful teacher bloggers, which is where I got most of my information. I did not get it from mainstream media. I got it from the bloggers. One of them is right here, Anthony Cody, who's done a wonderful job with and working with Diane Ravitch on something called the Network for Public Education. You sort of have to go to kind of underground sources to get information. So one of the things I advise strongly is don't believe anything you read in the paper about education. It simply is not true. And right now, the thing we're hearing so much of is students have lost all this time, all this, the pandemic has been just terrible. Look at their test scores. They've gone down, down, down. Well, guess what? Test scores are really not important. I mean, I will tell you a story about passing Physics 10 at Berkeley on the basis of a multiple choice exam. I knew nothing about physics. I had stopped going to the class 3 weeks into it. I had hit a wall. I couldn't understand it. I heard the exam was multiple choice, and I went and took it, and I got a C. That's what I think of multiple choice exams, and that's what we're hearing about, all this loss, this loss of learning because of the pandemic. So we really got to get more rigorous and do more testing, and we got to do rigor. I hate that word. Rigor mortis is what it is. But I mean, when somebody warns you about the falling test scores, just turn a deaf ear. I mean, that doesn't matter. I mean, what matters is that students learn other things that cannot be tested. And that's one of the huge messages of my book. Yeah, it's very bad how also, of course, all the Coke influence has been utterly silenced. You don't read about that in the press, that you have to go, you just have to do your own reading and check your sources. And when you read an op-ed page of the New York Times, check the writer, find out what think tank he represents, find out who funds that think tank. And often you could trace this stuff back to the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates is, he's a really complicated character. The power he has is the power of a god, and he is a college dropout. He knows nothing about education. He has a technocratic imagination. He thinks education is a technocratic system. I don't know his intentions. I mean, I don't think he's a demon or anything like that. I just think he's really quite uneducated when it comes to education. He should not have the power that he has been given. Anthony Cody wrote a book about this called The Oligarch and the Educator, which was very good. Again, these books exist, but you have to hunt for them. You have to find your own sources and not believe, again, I sound so conspiratorial, but I'm afraid this is kind of true. Any other questions?
Yes,
Okay.
there are several questions, and so what I will do is just go through the questions. There are also comments. I don't know whether we'll have time for those. What forms of resistance do you see as the most effective these days?
Yeah. Teaching and writing. It's like everybody has to begin from where they are in a way. This network for public education, which is trying to raise the consciousness of teachers. Many teachers are oblivious of these movements too. I mean, it's a wonderful organization. Check it out, the Network for Public Education. I'm not a person on the picket lines. I've always believed that teaching. I mean, you have to start from where you are. And as George Eliot, the end of Middlemarch, that wonderful quote at the end where she says, the good of the world is partly dependent upon unhistoric acts. Teaching is an unhistoric act. I mean, it's a very slow, you influence one person. I mean, there are people, Emily Lamb, where are you? I mean, you're a lawyer, you're out there in the world, you're doing wonderful law. There's another, there was a quote I wanted to read. This was a student who became a lawyer, and Claire Ellen, I don't know if she's here. I don't think she's here. Class of 2011. Thanks to the humanities program, I have the ability as an attorney to look at what I am reading and see the people and the money and the implications. And I ask, who is paying for this? What happens if it comes out this way or that? What's really important here? What will be the result of the precedent? I mean, she's asking who profits. Don't we wish all lawyers in the world were like Ellen? And then she goes on, she says, I learned hope. The professors who teach at places like Scripps are people who want and can see a better world. When my friends say, well, what do you expect? I say, I expect better. And I do all the time. That's a wonderful, I mean, she's so articulate. I expect better. And I mean, it's the ability to conceive of alternatives which I have hoped to teach, and which I hope every writer, everybody who writes in this, writes about that. I mean, we have to reach people. I mean, power and money are against us, but as Diane Ravitch says, the people, the numbers of people are on our side. I mean, she may be overly idealistic about that, but I mean, we have to get the word out. That's, I think, what resistance, the form of resistance I understand anyway.
Another question. What do you think of colleges like Mills being bought and subsumed into the larger corporate institutions? Is there hope for the survival of their liberal arts missions?
Yeah, I don't, that I would need a crystal ball for. I mean, I would say that there's not a lot of hope. I mean, that the larger the governing bodies become, the more out of touch they become with the conditions of the conditions that are conducive to teaching, which I've described, which are small classes. The more they buy into, credentialing degree as a credential to a job. I hate this, I mean, at least it's there, it'll survive, its campus will, maybe it'll survive in some form. What's happening to regional colleges is also something that ought to be known. They're so important. I mean, there's the flagship university, there's the state universities, and then there's community colleges. And these regional colleges, I guess they're what you would call state universities, are publicly funded. They're terribly important to underprivileged populations because they're people who can't afford to go away to school. They're regional, and they are really suffering. They're being absorbed into the flagship, So if you want to major in English at, regional college in Michigan, you may have to take your courses online. That's a real loss. That's a huge loss. Because they do amazing service. I mean, they're not so caught up in publishing. Their faculty are more involved in teaching. In fact, it's as you go down the prestige rank that you tend to get the better teachers. This community colleges, they're amazing. There's a book called Free City, which is about San Francisco City College. And I'm happy to send a bibliography to anybody who wants one. But, and also historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, they spend about a third per student, but they are also not caught up in this publish or perish thing nearly as much. And amazing teaching comes out of these schools. And you can see it in, the people they produce, the people who go on to become judges and, really strong forces in society. And they do that on a shoestring. And so do many community colleges. Yeah, that's important. Thank you for letting me say that, because you don't have to spend the kind of tuition that Scripps asks. Scripps often doesn't get that tuition, by the way. That's only the sticker price. I mean, many of my students, like one of my students said, it cost me less to come here than to go to UC Davis. So, I don't want to malign Scripps and say that we're the costliest thing in town, because we certainly aren't. And this is true of other high-priced liberal arts colleges. You have to check out the sticker price versus what they're actually offering in student aid.
Anna, how much time do we have? You're
Is
muted.
there another question?
There are a couple of other
Yes.
questions. Okay. Are college presidents committed to the liberal arts? Why are they staying fewer and fewer years?
Oh, God, that's a question to be asked. It's a hot seat being a president. There are so many factions now. Yeah, we just lost one. Scripps just lost one after 8 months. And before that, I think it was 5 years. And before that, it was 6 years. But there are some that come to stay. I mean, Michael Roth at Wesleyan, been there about 12 years. Carol Christ is hanging in there beautifully. At, yeah, I've seen at our school factions, people who were not pleased with a certain president because she was from the sciences and they thought she wasn't sufficiently theoretical. And I mean, they're just stuff. And then there's students who are, burned down Pomona College. Well, that's so counterproductive. It is so counterproductive. And the whole woke thing has made it very, very difficult for because it builds walls, it builds factions, some are superior to others. And college presidents, they just have a lot to deal with. And it tends to be harder at the small liberal arts colleges because the students feel entitled, because their professors have made them feel entitled, because we've emboldened them. And I see the humanities as tearing down walls, as stereotyping people in a classroom. You get to, diversity really matters because you meet people who are not like you. And at first you put them into your stereotypes and then you begin to see them as human beings. A human being emerges through a stereotype. I talk about this in some detail in the book because I go through it too. I mean, I see the blonde with the big hair, I see the kid with tattoos up the wall, and I go into this, oh God, kind of mode of let her not be that kind of student. And then it turns out she's not that kind of student. She's her own person kind of student. And so a stereotype is humanized. And what I don't like about the woke is that we're all building walls again. And anyway, that's not, college presidents have to deal with a lot, is what I'm saying.
There's
Okay, so we are coming close to the end of our session. Did Gayle answer all the questions? in the chat?
There's another just very general question. Someone who loves your classroom ethnography would like you to say more about your classroom experiences. So maybe you could just give us one example.
That's what the whole book is about. I actually love teaching. I mean, I just found it so interesting that this thing of people coming alive through their stereotypes of the various voices. And it was such a pleasure when a click, you could sometimes hear a click when something I said fell into place, or you could see it in students' eyes, and sometimes it was a group experience. So the entire group would get something like Macbeth. I would talk myself blue in the face about King Lear, it's a play about values. I mean, some people value this, some people are, individualists, and they had a hard time with Lear, but with Macbeth, there's some lines near the end of the play where he says, "I have lived long enough. I begin to be weary of the sun and wish the day were done," something like that. Why has he lived long enough? Because he's killed everything that makes life worth living, which is other people, human relationships, honor, love, and he knows it. He comes to this moment of realization. And every time I read that passage, I could see kids like, oh, yeah, right. That is what matters, is human relations. It doesn't matter if you become a king and everybody hates you. It matters that you have these qualitative relationships. Yeah, that was one. Those were moments where I could feel an entire group kind of getting something. And those
That's
are
so great. Yeah, that's wonderful. So to end up, would you tell us where people can get your book, and also are you available for book talks?
Yeah, well, the usual suspects, Amazon, I hate to say, but also, I don't know, the press, and independent bookstores, if you possibly can support them. I am not doing in-person talks, but I'm happy to do Zoom anytime. But I'm very leery about in-person events right now because I have some health issues, and so does my husband. And so we live like recluses, which is why it's so great to see you all. I mean, people I haven't seen in decades.
Do you want to put your email in the chat, Gayle, so
I
that
can-
people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm not very good at this, but I can try to do that.
Okay. And while you're doing that, Vivian, will you tell people again about how to get the recording? Because I think some people joined us after you explained.
Yes, the recording will be sent out to the FAB list. So if you're on the FAB list, you'll get it. If you're not on the FAB list, then send me an email and I will send the recording to you. And my email, I put it in the chat. I think it's the first message there. It's vpisano, VPISANO @lmi.net.
Great, thank you. Gayle, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
a really wonderful book. It's a great read and gives so much information, which is really important to be shared, and made me really think about what's happening now. And I think the book is really so, you were prescient in writing this book, because all of a sudden I see so many articles about what's happening to the humanities, and the book just really nails it. So I hope you will all read it, spread the word, and thank you so much for coming to this session, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you, Anna. Really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.